and up to date. And that in itself has taken an inordinate amount of time. And when it was published then by the CSO, we found that 52% of women and 28% of men surveyed reported having experienced sexual violence at some stage in their lifetime. 39% of women and 12% of men had experienced sexual violence as a child. These figures are just terrific, and we're throwing them out as if they're numbers without analysing the consequences of that for the psychological and mental health of those affected, of their families, the intergenerational effect, and the other effect on the economy or participating in a democracy. If you're desperately trying to survive as a victim, it's impossible to participate in society. And those that manage to do it have my respect. We have a study on the familicide and domestic and family violence death reviews that was published finally in May 23 last year. And I mention this because it was commissioned by the Department of Justice back in 19, and unfortunately Nora Gibbons, who did great work, and I want to pay tribute to her, and she died unexpectedly. And subsequently Maura Butler then was put in her place to complete it. However, the government that appointed Maura Butler also failed to recognise that Maura Butler had already been commissioned to carry out the statutory review of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017, which hasn't been carried out to date, Minister. She has now departed from that scene. I've no idea why, I'm sure there are reasons, but that review was never carried out. And the government is under a statutory obligation to carry out the review. Hasn't been done, and here we are in 2023, and no reasons given for that. Now, we're seriously committed to equality and treating women equally. Then that is the most basic review that should have been. You're failing in your legal duty. On foot of the recommendations of the homicide report, there were 3 groups to be set up: an interdepartmental group, an advisory group of NGOs, etc., an advisory group of families of victims. Have these groups been established? Is there clarification on that? The terms of reference, has that been clarified? And I'm going to finish, and give over to my colleague, in relation to this matter. I want to work with the government. I wanted to work with previous governments, but I have absolutely no faith that there's an understanding of what it is to be the victim of sexual and gender-based violence. The word epidemic has been used, and I took the trouble of looking up the word. We all know what it means, but it has no relevance at all to sexual violence. It's a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. That's what an epidemic is. And then a pandemic applies to multiple regions, like COVID or other infectious diseases. Sexual and gender-based violence is not an epidemic. It's not a pandemic. It is not a disease. It is a crime. And the word domestic violence upsets me because it reduces and it diminishes what is happening in relation to violence, mostly by men against women, but by some women against men. And when we reduce language like that, then we reduce our ability to act. We make it acceptable. And that's what happened for a very long time with the Gardaí, who didn't wish to interfere in a family situation where most horrific violence was being perpetuated against the woman. Since then, I know the government, the Gardaí, have improved with their protective units. But I despair yesterday and today when I hear of the threat in relation to the action that's promised, that the protective units will suffer or they'll be removed. After we worked years to get the guards to have an understanding, and some of them are excellent on the ground, but they were under-resourced, under-trained, and not educated in the sense that we all need to be educated in relation to the consequence of domestic and sexual-based violence. And finally, and the Cancórla was down there today, there's a conference sponsored by the Council of Europe, and I took the trouble of reading their report last year, which looked at the future of the Council of Europe, and they included a whole chapter on this sexual and gender-based violence. Such is the extent of it across the world. So when we clap ourselves on the back and we talk about a thriving economy and a rich country, we're doing it on the back predominantly of women and carers and they should be recognised and valued. So, Minister, if you're serious about this, and I believe you are, I'm happy to work with you, but I really would like clarification on the agency, the cost of it, also that it won't become just another layer of administration, and there must be a built-in review. And even that doesn't mean the review will happen, as we've seen in relation to the legislation I mentioned already, where we're waiting 3 years later for the review. But a review of this legislation is absolutely essential if we're serious in relation to dealing with this type of violence.
Thank you, Deputy Colleague.